It's our Conversations with Great Minds, deep dive into a topic and a person. This is Dr. Anna Lembke, professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic, author of the new book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Dr. Lembke, when we were so rudely interrupted by the needs of radio at the bottom of the last hour, or at the bottom of the hour here, you were beginning to explain to us how social media can become addictive and how that could have led to, that actual addiction could have led to people showing up on January 6th or, a whole spectrum of other weird behaviors that seem to come out of social media. You want to elaborate?
Sure. I mean, again, connecting with other humans is fundamental and basic and essentially adaptive and healthy. But what's happened online with social media is it's essentially drugified that phenomenon. And it's done that in a number of different ways. First of all, it's increased both the quantity and access to humans all over the world, which, again, could be a good thing, but can also potentially be a bad thing. It's made those potential interactions more potent by combining multiple drugs together. So, for example, combining human connection with gambling or human connection with sex or human connection with beautiful faces. The other thing, too, is that, we get a release of dopamine when people like us, when people regard us highly, and also when we're experiencing the same emotion at the same time as other people. So, for example, if you've ever wondered why there are YouTube videos that people watch of other people watching other people doing things, it's because we get dopamine when we experience the same emotion at the same time. And so when we're thinking about things like the January 6th rioting, probably what happened is this tribe connected online had a powerful surge of dopamine at their shared outrage and sense of injustice. And that bonded them together online. And when they met in person, that was even more potent. And that led to a kind of a frenzy where people were no longer able to make, good and informed judgments, about how to best to express their opinions. And of course, then that leads to things like violence. So, social media is this wonderful opportunity for social change and for positive human connection. But again, it's the likes, it's the infinite aspect, it's the way that it's become more potent and less nuanced. That really makes it, in some situations, dangerous.
I think most people are familiar with how honeybees can swarm. I'm assuming that that's probably dopamine mediated. Is that a similar phenomena to how mobs seem to have their own mentality? I heard a veteran on TV yesterday. He was saying that he had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he said, it's not the individuals you worry about. It's when you get 100 people in the street or more. The mob mentality takes over, and you're dealing with something that's not quite even not quite even human, I think was the phrase he used. I would say probably from your description, it's altogether way too human. But is that how a mob is different from simply a group of people?
Yeah, and I think the way to understand that is that we are exquisitely attuned to what people around us are doing. If you ever watch a flock of birds, if one bird is startled and raises its wing into the sky, immediately everybody, all the other birds will join it, even if they don't know why they're doing that. And, that's a basic survival mechanism, and it's a very primitive tribal survival mechanism. And it happens in humans too. When humans get together, the organism is much larger than any one individual, and it's responding to primitive cues and instincts that really override and defy an individual person's judgment. And we're all vulnerable to it. If you think you're not vulnerable, then you've never really been, caught up in a crowd. It's incredibly potent, and it probably does release huge amounts of dopamine.
Does that explain war and does it tell us anything we could do to prevent war, or is that a stretch too far?
I mean, I think what it does speak to is that we have our highly conserved primitive brain, including our reward pathway, which essentially works on these reflexive neurotransmitters like dopamine. But in addition to that, we have our prefrontal cortex, which is our great big gray matter that's right behind our foreheads, that communicates with our more primitive brainstem functions and allows us to really modulate those experiences and override reflexive impulses. And so what happens in a crowd or in a situation of extreme danger, sometimes it's good to have that prefrontal cortex modulating those instincts, and sometimes it's bad. Sometimes those instincts have to take the front seat or people won't survive. If you're at war and you're wondering whether or not, gee, should I shoot this person or not shoot this person who's got a gun pointed at me, you're probably going to die. So you wouldn't want to be thinking about that too long. But on the other hand, when we're talking about political issues or how to solve the complex problems that face nations today, you don't want to be operating out of your limbic brain. You don't want to let dopamine drive that. It's really important that we engage our prefrontal cortex and have nuanced, thoughtful, slow discussions about how best to tackle these really complicated problems.
Let's talk about how this all starts when we're when we're kids. Many years ago, a friend of mine, Dr. Joseph Chilton Pierce, wrote a book called The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. I wrote the foreword for it, actually. It's still in print. He's passed away now. But in that book, he touches on, and in another book, Magical Child, that he wrote, he really does a deep dive on what he calls the stages. He calls them the great demyelinations, that when we're born, our brain has this profusion of neurons, and that over time, it's sort of like Michelangelo chipping away pieces of granite or whatever it is, limestone, and out of that chipping away is revealed, David, right? And that the brain sculpts itself from the time that we're born. There's one great myelination at birth. There's another major one around 5 or 6 years old. That's when the magical episode, changes, the life changes. Another one when we hit adolescence, another big one when we hit around 20, 21 years old, and then it kind of stops. But at that point, we've got a lot fewer neurons, and our brain has been sculpted. How does our interaction, if my recollection of that narrative, it's been 20 years since Joe Pierce and I talked about this, and I wrote the foreword for his book, but if that's correct, what does that tell us about the impact of these addictive substances, be they heroin, nicotine, or social media, on brains that are in the process of being, you might want to even explain what demyelination is, that are being pruned? Yeah, no, thank you. That's a beautiful metaphor for what happens. You're absolutely right. When we start out early in life, we have more neurons than we're ever going to have later on. And it's not because we're smarter, but it's because our brains want to be highly adaptable and be able to adapt to whatever environment we find ourselves in. And of course, the human environment is changing all the time with each generation. So we go through what's called a pruning process, and that is a literal cutting back of the neurons that we don't use as often because we don't appear to need them for our given environment, and then a process of myelinating the neurons that we do use. And that myelination is adding a protective sheath that makes those neurons more efficient, kind of like insulation on a wire in an electrical circuit. And the result is that, especially through adolescence, there's a huge cutting away of neurons that we don't use up until and that process continues till about age 24 or 25. And the implication of that is if we give our kids an iPad and almost nothing else from an early age, they will, prune and adapt their neurons to that iPad, and they will lose other skills that they are not getting exposed to if they're not, learning to problem solve in real life without a computer, if they're not getting outside and moving their bodies. Likewise with more traditional drugs and alcohol, if kids learn that as a coping strategy, then it's going to be harder later on once our pruning process is complete to be able to develop new ways of coping in the world, new forms of distress tolerance, which is why it's so important to protect kids, to focus on prevention, to making sure that kids get healthy and adaptive coping strategies early on in life. I want to add that it doesn't mean that people can't get better later. Recovery is always possible, and we continue to generate new neurons throughout our lifespan, just not as quickly. Well, that's reassuring. That's reassuring. Yes. So, Dr. Lembke, I have a couple of grandchildren. One is 3 years old and one is 1 year old. And the 3-year-old, for a year during COVID, my wife and I were not hanging out with our daughter and her kids and her partner. And so we were communicating via screens. And for the 3-year-old at first, because he was 2 years old at the time, or a little less than 2 years old, at first the screen was like, what's this, you know? And it took him a while to figure out that there was somebody on the other side and that he could actually connect with us and all. I mean, you could see him going through that process of learning how to do this. The 1-year-old, this is where it got really fascinating, and I'm not sure what to make of it. The 1-year-old has now, I mean, she's literally now 1 year old. She, maybe a month, I think her birthday was a month ago. She, you know, our daughter will hold up the FaceTime screen, you know, the camera, and she immediately recognizes us, knows that we're grandma and grandpa, knows that we're real people. I mean, she's seen us in the real world as well as in this virtual world, and as had her older brother. And I'm wondering, how is that rewiring her brain and her brother's brain for that matter? And what does that mean? I mean, it's like we've got a generation growing up that understands reality in a way that I never did.
Yeah, I know. It's just so fascinating. I love that story. So, I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot to be optimistic about regarding this technology. I mean, the way that we were able to stay connected to loved ones during quarantine because of the technology is one of its many positive uses. And yeah, the incredible adaptability of young people, you know, whether it's Gen Zers or younger, they're almost cybernetically enhanced. The technology is just part of their DNA. And it's going to be really interesting to watch as they mature, you know, how they navigate that. Because, again, lots of good things about it, but then these real sort of dangers involving compulsive overconsumption, you know, exclusively living in this matrix, not appropriately investing in real-life relationships, the problems of addiction and access to all these drugs. So it's really the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I think it's a fascinating time. And I would be, you know, the last one to say that, you know, we should get rid of technology or social media is all bad. And even if I did say that, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. There's no going back. And I'm excited for Gen Zers and younger to sort of show us how they incorporate this incredible technology into their lives. Because if there's one thing humans have shown, they're highly adaptable, and whatever comes along, even if it's you know, got some serious problems associated with it, they eventually figure it out, and I think that's great.
Yeah. In part because of what I learned from Joe Pierce, we didn't have television. My wife and I, when our kids were growing up, this was through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we literally had no television in the house. They are all total readers. I mean, they know how to use television. But, you know, is that, should people be thinking about fasting social media from their kids?
Oh, I think so. I mean, you know, you intuitively, or maybe through your reading and your social network, realize that television is just a milder but equally pernicious form of this kind of screen fixation that we have. And to raise kids in an environment that's screen-free is to give them a huge gift and to really foster their neuroplasticity around other types of recreation, problem-solving, engagement. They'll eventually get to the technology, and they'll absorb it faster than we ever will. So you don't need to introduce it early. In fact, better to keep them from it for as long as possible.
Age of indulgence. Dr. Lembke, we were I was sharing with you my experience, my wife's and I experience of, in part because of our experience with Joe Pearson, Joseph Chilton Pierce back in the day, that starting in 1978 when in fact, our youngest hadn't even been born and our oldest was I don't know, 6, 7, 8, something like that. We got rid of the TV. We didn't have any television during the time that our kids were growing up. They seem to have done just fine. You know, they're all, you know, smart people with graduate degrees and have done well in the world. You know, knock wood, God bless them and all that. But what, you know, for parents who are debating whether to give their kids screens, I mean, you know, for my generation, it was, do you give your kids TV as a babysitter? Now it's, do you give your kids an iPad with a connection to Facebook or something like that as a babysitter?
Right.
What are the cautions in here?
You know, I do recommend that kids below the age of about 12 or 13 not have their own personal device, and that their time on screens be not just limited, but also highly monitored. And the reason for that is because, you know, the internet is essentially a portal to a lot of really awful stuff that kids should not be exposed to, and yet given free rein will inevitably enter all kinds of things into Google and end up someplace where we really don't want them to be. Also, I think it's essential in those early formative years, that first decade and a half in life, that we foster the tech-free coping strategies that are going to be so essential to serve our children as they grow, and also offer some kind of balance or ballast for the technology-soaked lives that they will inevitably lead later. So this means making sure that they're involved in sports or some physical activity, that they get together with friends in real life and learn how to negotiate and play in real life, that they, engage with reading, that they learn problem solving that's not just involving, Googling someone. And then come 12 or 13, it's not like that's a great time for them to have unfettered access, but what I've found, because we also raised our children without screens or devices, even our own, even without Wi-Fi to our house, but at some point our daughter, the eldest, came home and said she just can't even function as a high school student without Wi-Fi to the house and her own devices. And that turned out to be true. So we had to get all that, and then she got her own phone, and then the next kid got his phone. And truth be told, there's no way to monitor it. Once they get to be teenagers, they're going to do what they're going to do. And even with all the parental checks and wonderful things in place, they will find ways to circumvent what we put in place. So the key, in my opinion, is to make sure in those first 10 to 13 years, those formative years when we still have control over their lives, that we make sure that their screen access is highly limited, that we talk about the drugified, addictive nature of things online, that we teach them proper digital etiquette, and we teach them about values and morals related to their online use, how to be a good citizen online, and that we foster other activities that are not based on interacting online, because that's the only window we have.
Yeah. One of the things I learned years ago was that when I get caught in rumination, in painful introspection, why did I do that? The best way to break out of it for me is to stop and look at my environment, notice what I'm seeing, listen to what I'm hearing, feel what I'm feeling, and just be completely present. And it just breaks that pattern. You talk about that in your book as a way of dealing with all these addictions, whether it's a screen addiction or a drug addiction. We just have a minute and a half left. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, addiction really is about trying to escape ourselves, escape the world, numb ourselves, not be present. And the antidote to addiction is to do the opposite, to turn and face the things that we're running away from, to be fully present in the lives that we are given, to engage with those around us. That's really the antidote, to reach out, to be present, to invest in the world around us, instead of continually trying to run away from it.
Is there a larger strategy? Is this the sort of thing that we can teach our kids? Is this just a variation on Vipassana, on mindfulness?
It's related to mindfulness, but it's more than that. What I'm arguing for in Dopamine Nation is really a new kind of asceticism, where we intentionally avoid the hyper-convenient, pleasure-inducing world that we live in, and we intentionally seek out difficult, challenging, and even painful behaviors and experiences, because we are living in a dopamine-overloaded world. So, Buddha's middle way has really been adulterated by this culture of convenience. We have to now intentionally thinking about eschewing or rejecting convenience and pleasure and hedonism, and seek out things that are hard.
Yeah, and which would include what? Walking away from drugs, walking away from screens?
Yeah, it includes, so for example, whatever your drug of choice is, and as I talk about in the book, mine is romance novels, and I really did get, over a period of about 2 years, addicted to romance novels. I had to basically stop reading romance for a period of time. Yeah. So it's simple things like that, and then also engaging, again, in difficult things that will ultimately be a better and more enduring source of dopamine.
In and with the world. Dopamine Nation is the book, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Dr. Anna Lembke, you are brilliant. Thank you so much for dropping by today.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my pleasure. Great show.
Thank you.